Hi there and welcome to another Raid Shadow Legends video. I'm IceMan and today we are going to be delving into Defense Demons Part 2. Now, if you didn't catch Part 1, that was my last video, or possibly my second to last video. I'm not sure what my upload order is going to be at the moment, but there's a good chance it will have been my last video. Anyway, so if you've seen my last video, you know what this is about, you know what we're up to. If not, for those that are just tuning in, this may be your first video time you've ever seen one of my videos. Basically, in this game, there are a whole host of defensive champions. These defensive champions are not necessarily defensive. We'll take a look. We did this at the end of the last video. She was the last champion we looked at. I'm just going to show you quickly. So, Enchantress here is a defense-based champion. Her highest stat, not her health notwithstanding, is defense. Her damage, for the most part, I believe, is based off of defense. So, what does that mean? It basically means that whenever you build these champions up for higher defense, you're also building them up for higher damage. So their damage increases, but also their sustainability. It means they can take more damage. It means they can be a tank who's dishing out some big solid hits as well. Umbrella's a good example of that. She's a brilliant champion, has some great kit on her, and she's hard hitting, and she'll help you get through content. And that's the whole point of this two-part series. It's a two-part series mainly because the first time I tried this, it was just too long. I've split it into two videos, and the first video consisted of champions like Umbrella on my account that I have personal experience with. Some of the champions in part 2, this video, I do have experience with, but not as much, and I've certainly not done any guides on them or anything like that. Now, Umbrella here, I have done a guide on. If you check, I always do this, I point in the wrong direction. I'm thinking of that corner, so I point to that corner, and of course it's like a mirror when you're recording. Anyway, if you go look up in that corner right now, I'm going to post up the guide to Enchantress that I did. It's a great champion, well worth a look. So basically, we're going to, the first video was my champions. The second video, this video again, is a rundown through all the factions, bar one, because one of the factions didn't have any decent defensive champions I was happy with promoting or saying sounded decent. Some of the others I do have a little bit of experience with. I've certainly gone up against, I've watched guides on, I've seen them in the arena, I've seen them in various places, so I do have some experience with them, and obviously I've got a lot of experience with the game. I've been playing a long time, and I want to pass this knowledge on to those who don't. And the thing about these champions is they can be a real backbone to your team. They can dish out some damage, not necessarily the biggest damage dealers on the team, although there are a few like that. That new Iron Brago, absolutely massive damage dealer, brilliant. If you fused him, your quid's in, absolutely amazing champion. I will be doing a guide on him very soon. I've got another guide that I want to do on Vergis, which may come out before this video, it may not, I haven't decided yet. First, and then I'm going to be doing the Iron Brago one. Absolutely amazing champion, really love him. Champions like that can hit really, really hard and be backbone tanks to your account, and they'll help drag you through content that you otherwise would not get through with more squishy champions. So, without further ado, let's get back into the list, shall we? Next up, we're moving away from the champions that, I think I actually have this guy now, but I've not built him up, I've not used him at all, so I can't really talk about how great he is from experience. It's more from what I've seen and what I've read and what I understand of his kit. And that is, let me quickly find him. We're moving over to the High Elves. And where is he? Tyrell. Famous champion. Certainly when I came into the game, he was the probably most #1 sought after champion in the game almost. Everybody wanted this guy for clan boss because he brings you decreased defense and he has a decreased attack on his A1. It's a 50% chance when booked. He hits twice, so he's got a pretty solid chance of placing that on a very regular basis, and that's why everybody loved him, because he was great at keeping up decreased attack and therefore allowing you to survive longer on the clan boss. That's his A1. On his A2, attacks all enemies and has a 100% chance when booked of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. If the target is under a decreased attack debuff, it will also place a sleep debuff for 1 turn, and the damage inflicted is proportional to defense. This guy actually hits really hard. The main place I tend to see him more often than not, because I don't use him anywhere else, and that's where you tend to see champions, is in the arena. And actually I hate going up against this guy. Not so much these days. I deal with him fairly well with my team, but in the past I'd find that quite often he could be the last one alive and he'd still take out my entire team, because he hits like a truck and he doesn't go down basically. But that's true of many of these defensive champions. On his A3, he does decreases target's turn meter by 50%, and if it fully depletes turn meter, it places a stun debuff for 2 turns. Again, really solid. And then this guy has an increased ally defense in all battles by 25% aura. Really huge. You can't go wrong with that. So next up, also in this faction, we're basically moving through the factions now. There wasn't really anybody in the Bannerlords that stood out as a decent defense champion, which is a bit of a shame. It's maybe an area that Plarium needs to look at. Give us a decent defensive champion in the Bannerlords, please. We have Vergis, however you pronounce it. Anyway, he's a pretty solid champion. I really like this guy. I use him on my alternate account, or certainly I used to a lot, to pair with Seer, because he puts out loads of buffs, and I don't have a Mausoleum Mage over on that account. As you can guess, well, as I said, he places loads of buffs, so he's really great for that. Attacks one enemy, has a 40% chance of placing a 30% reflect damage buff on a random ally for 2 turns. So reflect damage on a random ally, that's 1 buff straight off. The buff chance can be booked up to 50%. Then his A2, which I think is kind of his big money ability really. Aegis places a 15% continuous heal buff, a 30% increased speed buff, and a 30% reflect damage buff on a target ally for 3 turns. It is only the one target ally. Annoyingly, if it was on everybody, he'd be probably broken actually, but really solid. And he also places a 50% ally protection buff on all allies except for this champion for 2 turns. Places a 60% increased defense buff on this champion for 2 turns. So ally protection on everybody else, increased defense on himself. Again, he is a defensive based champion, so he's then going to be hitting harder and taking less damage, which is really solid. This can be booked down to 3 turns. His passive, Second Wind, places a shield buff on this champion equal to 10% of their max HP for 2 turns whenever this champion loses 10% or more of their max HP from a single hit. So he takes a big hit, he puts a shield buff up. There's another buff that people can rip off if they need to. Active effect. This is on a 3-turn cooldown, but it can be booked down to a 1-turn cooldown, effectively. Places a continuous heal buff on this champion for 2 turns every time their HP drops below 50. So it's well worth booking him out, and basically it's got a 1-turn cooldown, and then he gets a continuous heal again. So again, really solid, really good support champion that can keep himself alive and keep teammates alive while doing some okay damage as well. And next we are moving over to the Sacred Order, and we are back to legendaries again, and we have a champion I don't have, as you can see, Martyr, one of the 3 only counter-attack champions in the game, along with Valkyrie and Skullcrusher, who I believe we'll be mentioning later too. I think I need to double check that one, because I actually left him off. I've got a nice little list here of the champions I want to talk about, and I swear I left him off, but I could have sworn he's actually defense based, and he is a decent champion. So if he is defense based, he needs to be in this video. Plain and simple. On her A1, attacks one enemy, has a 45% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. That's on her A1. Alright, it's only a single target, but still solid. If you bring her into clan boss or whatever, you don't need anybody else to do decreased defense, because she's doing it and she's providing the counter attack. Then on array 2, she places a 60% increased defense buff and a counter attack buff, and all allies for 2 turns, again increasing the damage that she does. And if any other teammates, say Razin, happen to be on the team, although you wouldn't necessarily need Razin, but he does bring the weaken too, don't forget, and he does some solid damage, we'll then get more damage out of this as well, and this can be booked down to a 3-turn cooldown. Then on array 3, attacks all enemies and places a 50% increased attack debuff for 2 turns, which again, decreased attack, so again that helps with the clan boss and helps keep that decreased attack on more often. She's not, it's too low a cooldown even when booked at 4 to be your only decreased attack champion, but as a backup for your decreased attack champion, can come in clutch and help keep that buff up, debuff up, which you need it. She's got a nice aura, increase ally defense in all battles by 33%. One of the best champions in the game probably, although that list is getting rather long because they're bringing out so many decent champions. Just in the time I've been playing, they've added so many great champions, it's kind of hard to keep track of, and doing tier lists is probably almost impossible, and nobody will agree on who should be up there these days. Anyway, moving on. She is actually the only decent defensive champion in this faction as far as I'm aware. Actually, we'll give an honourable mention to Lightsworn. He is defence based, he does have a very good defence pool. He's a void champion, so he's a bit harder to get, but he's also an epic. He attacks one enemy 3 times, decreases the target's turn meter by 10%, so, you know, this again would be much better if it was per hit, at least then you can get a 30% decreased turn meter. But 3 turn hitter means he's usable in the Fire Knight, so that's kind of handy there, and being void, he's not weak. His A2 attacks one enemy, places a 50% decreased attack debuff and a 30% decreased speed debuff for 2 turns, so he can be, to a degree, your decreased attack champion in the clan boss. He also decreases speed, which is quite handy. And then on his A3, he places a 60% increased defense buff and a revive on death buff on all allies for 2 turns. So again, pairing him with other defensive champions, really cool. You're going to get that increased defense and a revive on death, so that if they do die, they then pop back up and do more damage. So he is actually a pretty solid champion. I've just never really used him, and actually I must admit I completely missed out on him going through all this. But we've rectified that and added him too. There are other champions like Romero who are defensive, but I kind of think they're meh champions, so I've left them out of the list. And who have we got next? Barbarians. Now barbarians, we're going to have, obviously we've covered 2 barbarians here. We're also going to be covering more. Unfortunately they are pretty much all legendary. Here's the big boy himself, Oltan, a champion I would absolutely love to have. I've never gotten him on either of my accounts, but I would be very happy to have him. Hits like an absolute truck. Does a decreased attack on his A1, which makes him great for the clan boss. It's a 60% chance that can be booked up to 75%, so it's a pretty solid chance, especially if you pair him with counter attack champions or ally attack champions. His A2 attacks one enemy, places a 60% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns, so again pairs really well with defensive champions. You put him and Razin together, you've got your decreased defense, your decreased attack, weaken, and they're both going to hit harder because of the increased defense, so really solid pairing. He also places a shield buff on all allies for 2 turns, equal 20% of their max HP if the attack kills an enemy. Not so great for clan boss obviously because you're not killing him, but for other areas of the game, i.e. dungeons, arena, you name it, really solid ability. He then also has an ability here where he revives a random ally with 30% HP every time he kills an enemy. Again, doesn't help you in the clan boss, but in all other areas of the game is really big, can help pick people up. If everybody is already alive and he uses this passive, it rolls around. He kills somebody and everybody is alive. It's the whole based on he kills somebody. He resets the cooldowns on this champion's skills if the champion kills an enemy and all allies are alive. So, you know, you really can't go wrong there. He either revives people or resets his cooldowns, bringing this back around, which is really cool and really solid. So, you know, and then he's also got an increased ally defense in all battles by 33% aura. Absolutely huge. This guy's a beast, an absolute beast. Next up, I believe we have Kantra. If you've been playing for a while, she was a more accessible champion due to the fact that she was a fusion. I can't remember if she was an actual fusion champion or a fragment champion, but it doesn't really matter. Either way, she was therefore more accessible to the game. This girl is a solid tank. She attacks one enemy 2 times. Each hit has a 40% chance of stealing one random buff from the target. Pretty cool in arena. I quite like her. She's really solid. Hits pretty decently. Her A2, Chaos Tempest, has a brilliant animation and then attacks all enemies 3 times. So this makes her quite solid for the Fire Knight. A2, A1 hits twice, solid for the Fire Knight. And she's great on the Spider's Den as a Spider tank. So, you know, many places where she's really useful. Faction Wars, again, she's good, she's solid. Each hit has a 50% chance of placing one of the following debuffs for 2 turns. Block buffs, 50% decrease attack, 30% decrease speed, 25% weaken, a 50% decrease accuracy, or a 100% heal reduction debuff. So you think she attacks all enemies 3 times. If it procs, I'm not saying it's going to, it'd take a lot for them all to proc at a 50% chance, although that can be booked up to 75% chance, giving you a more solid chance anyway, and reducing the cooldown down to 3 turns. You can effectively stick all these debuffs on all your enemies, which is huge. Pair that with a passive and you're talking about a really solid champion here. No Escape decreases each enemy's accuracy for 10 for each debuff they are under, and she can place a lot of debuffs, so that's really solid. This champion will receive 4% less damage for each debuff on the attacker, so she takes less damage while that's the case. Heals this champion by 1250 HP each time a debuff expires on an enemy. All those debuffs tick off. This is why she's great on the spider with all those spiderlings. All those debuffs tick off and she just gets healed. It's really brilliant. She has a 75% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn on enemies under 5 or more debuffs at the start of this champion's turn. This is a little hard to get to come into play. It works sometimes in the spider, and if you put her in sets like Frost set, for instance, where it pairs well, because if you're already getting them under provoke, they will be coming at you and then getting frozen. The other handy thing is, if they're coming at you anyway because you're the tank, you know, you're the negative affinity and all the rest of it, so there's a good chance they're coming at you anyway. They're getting frozen, that puts another debuff up there, which again puts a provoke and means that it's just more likely that they're coming to you, and they're not going to suddenly decide to go to somebody else because somebody else, she dropped in hell for, somebody else dropped in hell for, whatever else happened. This champion can place debuffs on weak hits. It's part of her passive. So she, again, which is what makes her brilliant for the spider. She's got an aura which increases ally accuracy in all battles by 60, which is huge. Again, this makes her quite good for Doom Tower. Places lots of decent debuffs that you can use, plus a big increase in accuracy. I must admit, I'd forgotten she had this myself. I may well start using her more for this, if nothing else. I mean, not for nothing else, because she is solid anyway. But because of this, I might start using her in Doom Tower, where obviously people do need more accuracy. And next up, moving away from this faction and down to the Ogrin tribes, and over to Ignatius. Now, as you can see, I don't own this champion, but he's a pretty solid champion, does a lot of damage, good damage dealer. His A1 attacks one enemy, has a 15% chance of placing a stun debuff for 1 turn. This can be booked up by another 10, giving it 25% chance. It's not huge, it's okay, it's nothing special. But his A2 attacks all enemies, has a 50% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn, which is pretty decent. So again, he's the sort of person you can stick him in a frost set and he's going to be freezing people. His A3 attacks all enemies and has a 75%, 100% chance when booked of placing a HP burn debuff for 2 turns. It can be booked down to 5-turn cooldown. That's the only negative I would say with him, is obviously if you're trying to use him for your HP burn champion on spiders, is quite a long cooldown with 5 turns when booked, and you have to book him first to get that, otherwise it's 6. But he is still a really solid champion. He does all of this based on defense, so he's got a good defensive pool, he's easier to keep alive, and he does a load of damage to boot. He's got an aura that increases allied defense in all battles by 25%. Is there anybody else here that we wanted to look at? Yes, the man that we mentioned before that I'd completely forgotten about and skipped somehow. Skullcrusher, the other counter-attack champion in the game. Also defense based. Also has a decent solid defense pool. Not as high as many. But the only champion in the game who brings counter-attack as an epic and not a legendary. So very wanted champion by many people, and a very solid champion at that. Attacks one enemy, places a 50% heal reduction debuff if the target's defense is lower than this champion's. You build him up with high defense, there's always a good chance of that, so yeah, pretty solid. His A2 Stonewall places a 50% ally protection buff on all allies except for him for 2 turns, places a counter attack buff on all allies except for this champion for 2 turns, and places an unkillable buff on this champion for 1 turn. I actually use this guy in an unkillable comp on my alternate account. It's not the most reliable and I can't get it to work on affinities yet, but still very solid champion, and very, very solid ability, as you can see. And obviously all those allies that are getting attacked, they then go out and smack people back with their A1, so yeah, really solid champion all around. This guy also has a passive which decreases the duration of all debuffs on the champion by 1 turn at the start of each turn. So if you're getting one of those debuffs like a 1 turn provoke or something, it just falls off and it doesn't even affect him. Absolutely brilliant. I find that really annoying, to be fair, in the arena and in dungeons when I go up against him, or Doom Tower or whatever, that can be a right pain. His aura increases ally resisting faction crypts by 45%. Nothing big, nothing huge, but still good. And he is a very solid champion, as we say. Amazing in the game for being one of the 3 solo counter-attack champions. Next up, we have Grush the Mangler, who I believe was another freebie that we get after X amount of days of playing the game. Pretty solid champion. I actually think he looks more like Orc than an Ogre in Tribes, to be fair, but you know, each of their own. His A1, Goreslick, attacks one enemy and has a 50% chance of placing a leech debuff on the target for 2 turns before attacking. Now, if you don't know, leech is actually kind of really important for getting through Sorath, the Frost Spider in Doom Tower. So this guy is an actually beast of a champion for you to build up, and leech is obviously a very useful ability because it heals you back when you do damage on the champion. And say for Frost Spider, this is big. It stops, if you read through it all and everything, it basically stops the Frost Spider from getting increased attack and mullering you and doing severe damage to you. His A2 attacks all enemies, so nice AoE, has a 60% chance. This can be booked up to 100 again. Chance of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff for 30, or a 30% decrease crit damage debuff for 2 turns. That's the only thing I never liked about this guy and this ability, is I really feel that he should have decrease attack and decrease crit damage rather than one or the other, because you don't know what you're going to get. So you can't. It makes him less reliable for situations like clan boss or anything else that you might use him in. If it wasn't for this, where he did both, or just only did the decrease attack, it'd be a lot more usable in, say, the clan boss, where you can put the leech up and help heal your team, and also do the decrease attack and help keep your team alive on a 4-turn cooldown. So he's not going to be your only decrease attack champion, but he can do it fairly, he can be a good backup one. Then his A3 attacks all enemies and places a 50% continuous heal buff on all allies for 2 turns. Places an additional 7.5% continuous heal buff on all allies for 1 turn if at least one enemy is hit with a critical hit. So you build him out for crit, does again AoE damage, and places masses of heals on all your team. I must admit, I've probably slept on this guy a bit more than I should have done. And I believe we are now moving on to the Lizardman. Obviously we covered one here, and we're now covering another one, Krisk the Ageless. I do apologise for the length of this video, I know it's very long, but we have a lot of champions to get through. Thankfully there's not too many more to go, I don't think. If you've bared with me this long, I do appreciate it. Krisk the Ageless, one of the best defensive champions in the game, one of the best tanks in the game. His A1 attacks all enemies and has a 30% chance of placing a 30% decreased speed debuff for 2 turns. AoE on the A1 is absolutely amazing. AoE on his A2 attacks all enemies and places a 50% ally protection buff on all allies except for this champion for 2 turns. Places 2 15% continuous heal buffs on this champion for 1 turn. Increases the duration of all ally buffs by 1 turn. It's the skill that keeps on giving. And then we've got his A3, places a provoke debuff on all enemies for 1 turn, places a 60% increased defense buff on this champion for 2 turns, places a 30% increased speed buff on all allies except this champion for 2 turns. That's a mouthful and a lot to go through, but again, this guy just gives and gives and gives till it hurts. Then he has a passive, if that wasn't enough. At the start of each round, places a shield buff on all allies for 2 turns equal to 50% of this champion's max HP. So although he is a defensive champion, you've got a good solid reason to build him out for HP rather than defense, to be fair. Has a 75% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff and a 50% decreased attack debuff on the attacker for 1 turn when hit. So, you know, absolutely huge. Just amazing. Brilliant tank. Brilliant champion. Wish I had him, but I don't. To the Skinwalkers. These guys are a little bit lax in decent defensive champions. They do have defensive champions like Warchief, who is okay, and if he's the only legendary you've got in this faction, you're going to be using him in Faction Wars, but he is not a brilliant champion, neither are the Bears in my opinion. The only champion I've picked out in this faction is a rare. Greybeard here. This guy attacks one enemy, has a 50% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn. Attacks all enemies on his A2, has a 25% chance of placing a freeze debuff for 1 turn. Damage inflicted is proportional to defense. So he's got freeze on his A2, AoE, at a 40% chance on a 4 turn cooldown, which is pretty solid. And then on his A3, places a shield buff on this champion for 2 turns, has an 80% chance, 100 when booked, chance of placing a counter attack buff on this champion for 2 turns. The value of the shield is proportional to the defense. This buff cannot be removed, so it can't be removed. He gets a big shield if you build him out with big defense. It's on a 4 turn cooldown if you fully booked it out, and because of the counter attack, he goes out and he lands more provokes. So yeah, he's a really solid champion, this guy, especially for a rare. And if you're coming up in the game, he's the sort of champion that's going to again help you get through content, and you put him in, say, a frost set or a stun set or something like that, you know, you're going to get even more out of him. And where are we next? We're over to the Orcs, I believe we've already covered. Oh no, actually I missed out one in the Orcs that is a very solid champion. We can't gloss her over, so good job I looked here rather than just going off my list. In the Orcs, other than obviously Iron Braga, who we've already covered, you've got Sandler Survivor. She is, of course, Spirit Affinity. Her A1 attacks one enemy 2 times, has a 30% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 on the target for 1 turn if the champion has no debuffs. Heals by 15% of the damage inflicted if this champion is under any debuff. So self-heal on the A1. A2 attacks all enemies, decreases the duration of all enemy buffs by 1 turn, increases the duration of all ally buffs by 1 turn. Takes their buffs down, put yours up, that's great. Really solid champion, can hit pretty decently as well. And then she has a passive. Born Survivor places 50% ally protection buff on all allies for 2 turns when an ally's HP drops below 50%. Also places a block damage buff on this champion for 1 turn. And this is on a 4 turn cooldown when booked out. She also has an aura, increases allied defense in all battles by 25%. So again, really solid champion. I don't have her on this account, but really worth building out if you do have her. Next up, we have a freebie. Drexar Blood Twin. This chap you can get for free if you collect his fragments from doing the 3v3 arena on a daily basis. I must admit, I far too often forget to pick him up, so I'm close but still not quite there on getting him yet. Interesting champ. His A1 attacks 1 enemy 3 times, so good for the Fire Knight. Has a 30% chance of placing HP buff, HP burn debuff for 2 turns. That's on his A1. Heals his champion by 20% of the damage inflicted if the target is under a HP burn debuff, so he heals himself as well. And again, like we say, he's also defense based, so he's going to be taking this damage anyway. On his A2, attacks all enemies, has a 40% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn. This chance increases to 100% if the target is under a HP burn. So he's already under HP burn, he definitely gets a provoke, that's sorted. And when you're attacking all enemies, you can't go wrong there, that's brilliant. Also places 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns if the provoke debuff is placed. This can be booked down to a 3 turn cooldown. You can also book the chance up to 50%, so there's a reasonable chance of it landing anyway. Then he has a passive, 55% chance of placing HP burn debuff for 2 turns on every attacker when hit. This champion's resistance increases by 10 for every enemy under a HP burn debuff, stacks up to 50. This guy is quite frankly going to be amazing in the Doom Tower. It'd be really useful against Sorath, where you really need that HP burn, and his resistance is going to go up for the HP burns that are up, so therefore making it harder to have stuff done to him, so great. Then on top of that, he's got an increased ally accuracy in all battles by 70, which again is huge, and again huge for the Doom Tower, so really solid champion. And again free, which we like. Now there's another one here who obviously I've not played with, I've not seen him in the game yet at all. He's one of the ones we have to get through doing Doom Tower. Akoth the Seared. We'll run through his skills, so he does seem pretty decent. Attacks 1 enemy, has a 50% chance of placing a 30% decrease crit rate debuff for 2 turns on his A1. On his A2, attacks all enemies, has a 20% chance of placing HP burn debuff for 2 turns. The chance of placing the debuff increases by 20% for each enemy alive, which is pretty solid. It's really going to help you out on waves. Then his A3 attacks all enemies, has a 50% chance of increasing the cooldowns of all skills by 2 turns on enemies under HP burn. Also places a shield buff equal to 20% of this champion's max HP and all allies for 2 turns. Instantly activates this skill when this champion is revived by Rian the Conjurer, so if you happen to pair him with her, then yeah, that activates straight away there. He has a passive, Fiery Swath, has a 10% chance of placing a fear debuff on an enemy for 1 turn whenever they receive damage from a HP debuff placed on themselves, which is really solid. Then on top of which, he's got an aura, increases ally HP in all battles by 25%. It's weird because he is a defense based champion and he does damage based off of defense, but then he's got stuff like shields based off of his max HP, which make you want to build out his HP. Personally, they should have done the shield off of his defense, and they should have given him a defensive aura rather than off of HP. But still, looks like a really solid champion and a very solid support, defensive champion. Next up, we have another epic on the team. Padma, one of the best decrease attack champions in the game, and was my decrease attack champion for the clan boss for a very long time. So she attacks one enemy 2 times. If this attack is critical, has 100% chance when booked of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff on all enemies for 2 turns. She attacks twice, and so even without booking a chance up, you've got a pretty solid chance of landing this every time with her A1. But you book it up and you've actually got 100% chance on the A1. You pair her with a counter attack champion, that decrease attack is not falling off, or at least very unlikely to. Her A2 attacks all enemies, has a 35% chance of placing a 50% decrease accuracy debuff for 2 turns. Actually, she could be quite solid for the Doom Tower, I'm thinking, as well, to be fair. That's the thing with Doom Tower coming out, you maybe have to go back and look at champions you've not used in other areas for a long time, because their value may well have increased now. This is a good solid AoE hit, it does a lot of damage. Decrease accuracy solid, you can increase the buff chance by another 15%, take it up to 50. Increase the damage and get the cooldown down to 3 turns. Then on her A3 attacks one enemy and removes all buffs from the target and places them on this champion. She just steals all their buffs. That is really cool, really solid. Very cool champion, and again defensive base, so harder to kill and does a good amount of damage. And next up we have our other rare that we have in this roundup. Hound, defensive based, only a rare. His defense is fairly solid. I'm not going to go through all his abilities because I don't think they're that well. Alright, so he's got decreased speed on his A1 for 2 turns. He's got a chance, he places a continuous heal, small version, and reflect damage on all allies for 2 turns on a 2-turn cooldown when booked, which is pretty solid support, especially if you're coming up in the game. He's also, if you build him right, the fastest, if not, or at least certainly one of the fastest campaign farmers, and can do it in 6 seconds. He has very fast animations on his A1, which is an AoE, and yeah, so he does that brilliantly. He does multiple attacks, all the rest of it, hits them really quickly and takes them all down. Absolutely brilliant. Then on his A3, places a block damage buff on an ally for 1 turn. For a rare champion, this guy is really, really solid. And again, like I say, easier to keep alive because he's defensive based. And we're now moving on to the Undeads, and we're finally getting through. I do apologise at the length of this video, but maybe I should have broken it up into sections, and we may well yet do that. In hindsight, here there's not a lot to go through. At least we've got Necret the Great, a new addition to the game. Obviously I don't have him. Looks really amazing. I kind of want to not read through all his abilities because he's got too many. So his A1 attacks one enemy 3 times. Each hit has a 20% chance of placing a decrease attack debuff for 1 turn. This effect cannot be resisted, which is really solid. Can be booked up to 30% with 3 hits. That's pretty solid. His A2 teams up with allies to attack one enemy. All allies under ally protection buffs placed by this champion will join the attack. So he's a really solid clan boss champion. Grants an extra turn if this attack does not kill the target, so then he gets an extra turn afterwards anyway. Then we've got his A3, which places a block debuffs buff, a 50% ally protection buff, and a 25% strengthen buff on an ally for 3 turns. The ally protection buff cannot be removed. This can be booked down to a 3-turn cooldown. Then he has a passive. Whenever an ally is attacked while under ally protection buff, placed by this champion places a shield buff on the ally equal to 30% of the champion's max HP for 2 turns. Occurs only if the ally does not already have a shield buff placed by this champion. So he's quite regularly placing shields. Also decreases the cooldown of this champion's Legion of Damn skill by 2 turns if the shield buff is placed. Then he has this one, which places a block debuffs buff and a 25% strengthen buff for 3 turns on an ally with the lowest max HP at the start of each round. Also places a 50% ally protection buff on them for 6 turns. So he's constantly placing those ally protections so they can then come in and do the ally attack with him. On top of that, he's got an increase his ally resist in all battles by 60. This guy is a beast, an absolute beast. So next up, we've got Kaiden. I did say that actually there's not that many epics in this roundup, but that's actually probably not true, to be fair. There's a lot more than I thought. Kaiden is a Dark Elves champion. Attacks one enemy, chance of replacing provoke on the defense. I'm going to start speeding up a bit here because I really want to get to the end of this video. It is already very, very long. Then on his A2, attacks all enemies and has a 100% chance when booked to placing a 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns, which is really solid. Then on this guy's A3, revives 2 random allies with 50% HP and places a 60% increased defense buff on them for 1 turn. Pair him with defensive champions and they're going to be doing more damage as well as being survivable again. This can be booked from a 6 turn cooldown down to 4, so decent solid champion for the faction, and all in all a good champion for keeping alive and whatnot. Next up we have Crimson Helm. Not a champion I have a lot of experience with. I do have her on one of my accounts, I think. I've just never really used her much. Decrease attack on the A1, 4 times at random, place 100% chance when booked, I believe, or 95 or something like that. With the right masteries that would be 100 chance of placing a provoke. Places a block damage buff on this champion for 1 turn along with doing the provoke. Then on the A3, on a 4 turn cooldown when booked, places a revive on death and an increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns. Again, great for defensive champions, increasing that defense and giving them a revive on death, so they die, they pop straight back up again, which is really cool. Also has an increases ally HP in dungeons by 33%, which is pretty solid. And next up we have the only Knight Revenant I picked in this faction. They're a bit weak for defensive champions, I have to say, and many people would argue he shouldn't even be in the list. Whirling Frostking. I actually personally think he's a fairly decent champion. He's not game breaking, but he can do some pretty solid damage, and he's an okay support to boot. So could he do with a bit of a buff? Yes, I think he probably could, but all in all he's still a pretty decent champion, and I really do love the way he looks. This guy, if you don't know, came out for the one and only battle pass that we had, and as we played along we got him, Stag Knight, various other champions, the 2 bears, and he was the final champion you got. And yeah, he's not amazing, but he is good. He's got a freeze on his A1, places a perfect veil on an ally with the lowest HP for 1 turn if the freeze is placed. On his A2, attacks all enemies, so it's an AoE hit, and then when booked out has a 100% chance of placing a 30% decreased crit damage debuff for 2 turns, places a 30% increased crit damage buff on all allies for 2 turns. Again, that can be a big boost to damage, 30% crit damage. That's really nice and really solid, and even if he's not the best champion out there, he can be a good solid support, you know. Then on his A3, he's got a 25% strengthen buff and a 60% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns. Again, really great move, really solid. Then for an aura, he's got an increased ally defense in arena battles by 30%. Funny enough, the arena's the one place I don't really think he's that great. He's okay, but I think he's maybe a bit better elsewhere. And then we're on the last faction. I do again apologise for the length of this video. It is very long, I know, and we've got a few to go through here because the dwarves have a lot of defensive champions. First up we have Tormund the Cold. He has a freeze on his A1. Instantly activates his skill whenever an enemy under both a freeze and a HP burn debuff takes damage from the HP burn debuff. So that's pretty solid. Removes all buffs from a target enemy and then attacks the target 2 times, steals all buffs instead if the target is under a freeze debuff already. Will ignore defense if the target is under both a freeze and a HP burn debuff. Really solid champion. I wasn't in the game when they did a fusion for him. I really wish I was, and I've never managed to pull the guy, and I think he's a brilliant champ. And on his A3, attacks all enemies, places a block debuffs buff and a 100% heal reduction buff for 2 turns on enemies under freeze. Has a 60% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn on enemies not under freeze. Decreases the cooldown of 1 random skill of each ally by 1 turn for every enemy attacked under both freeze and a HP burn debuff. So from the looks of it, he's actually a good champion to pair with somebody that does HP burn, because he gets a lot of utility from that. So you place him with somebody that does HP burn, and he places the freezes, and then he gets more out of it. So yeah, and then he's got an aura that increases ally defense in all battles by 33%, which is very good. Next up we have Grizzled Joel. He's not an amazing champion in my books, but he is solid. Has a 35%, I believe that books up to 50% chance of placing 100% heal reduction debuff for 2 turns on his A1. His A2 places a block debuffs buff on all allies for 1 turn, which is what he's most used for in certain killables and the like. Places a 60% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns though as well. So again, putting that increased, and it's on a 3 turn cooldown. So you get the increase defense and a block buff debuffs, which is pretty solid for a support. Then his A3 attacks all enemies and has a 100% chance when booked of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff on all enemies for 2 turns. He also decreases each target's max HP by 30% of the damage inflicted. So again, he's great for that boss where I can't remember the name of him, the Scarab King or whatever, where you actually need to decrease his max HP to start doing more damage to him. This guy can come in and do that for you without having champions with a destroy set or something, and he'll do it on his A3. So real solid champion. Does take a lot of books in this ability. It's on a 5 turn cooldown, can be booked down to 4. Not one of my favourite champions, but he is still a good solid champion. Rearguard Sergeant, somebody I've only recently got, and because I got one, I got another one 2 minutes later. You know how this game works. Again, a really solid champion. Not a huge fan of the look on this one. I don't like that mask, mainly just because I find it a bit creepy. But we've got an A1 that decreases defense, an A2 that decreases attack, and it's an AoE hit, which is really solid, and it heals this champion by 25% of the damage inflicted. And then we've got an A3 that places an ally protection buff and a 15% continuous heal buff on all allies except for this champion for 2 turns on a 3 turn cooldown when booked. She's got an aura that increases force ally HP in all battles by 33%. That one I don't like. I don't like this force ally only nonsense. And then last but not least, we have Rockbreaker, another solid defensive champion. He attacks one enemy, increases this champion's defense by 4% each time this skill is used. Stacks up to 20%, so you can get an increase on his defense of 20%. He places a provoke and a counter attack on himself. This is an AoE provoke, by the way, 100% chance for 1 turn, and then counter attack on himself for 2 turns. So basically draws them in with the provoke and then goes back and hits them because of the counter attack. So really solid. His passive has a 25% chance of decreasing damage inflicted on this champion by 50% each time this champion is attacked. So he can be a real damage soaker and just soak up damage, which is really cool. And he has an aura that increases ally defense in arena battles by 30%. So again, I am sorry at the length of this video. Oh no, actually I'm missing one. He's not the last but least. There is one more. He's actually a rare, if I can spot him. Here he is, Bulwark. Like I say, the dwarves do have a lot of them. He has a weaken on his A1, 2 hitter, 100% chance when booked out of placing a HP burn debuff for 2 turns on a single target on his A2, and then he has a passive that when attacked has a 30% chance of extending the duration of all debuffs on the attacker by 1 turn. You put him in the clan boss, he puts HP burn out there and weaken, and he can be your debuff extender, so help keep the it's only a 30% chance. I do wish that was a bit higher, but it's a solid ability on a solid gem. So there you go. All these champs help keep themselves alive, help keep your team alive, and do a lot of damage to boot for the most part. And where they're not dealing damage, they're providing a lot of utility and support. So yeah, definitely worth looking into all these champs. I hope you enjoyed this video. I do apologise at the length. If you stuck with me through the whole thing, I really appreciate it. Please hit that like button if you enjoyed the video. If you really hate me for doing such a long one, post it in the comments. And yeah, if you do like my content, please hit the subscribe button, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye.